Okay. So, yeah, think about those same dimensions of today and in the future that the Lord gives us. So what dimensions of our age constrain or barriers to or facilitate the intercultural transmission of the gospel? And how, ask God, how has he wired you? What experiences has he given you to fit in? Now, I don't like the word barriers, so if you can come up with a better one, that's fine. Hurdles. I was never a very good hurdler, but all right, maybe that's good. Barriers can range from locked doors to closed, but doors that actually aren't locked. And if you see a barrier, especially a locked door, don't assume that it looks or is the same to others. Take into account the great international migration of peoples in our age. Now, I've been out of things a little bit, particularly with the pandemic. And I'm looking at my sister here, who I think has spent way more time in Texas than the Philippines. There used to be 6 training programs in Manila. I don't know if they still exist. Maybe somebody else knows. To train women who were going to work as housemaids in the Middle East. Right? Now, if any of us walked into the Saudi embassy and said, I want to be a missionary in your country, what would happen? You'd be out. But who puts Saudi princes and princesses to bed? I'm told it's not their parents.
Filipinos and Indians.
And Indians and.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Lord is far cleverer than we are. I think also has a sense of humor. It says in the Old Testament, he who sits in the heavens laughs. It's not a barrier. In fact, you get paid to do it. And I guess if the kids behave, who cares? It said this is the first generation since before the rise of Islam, growing up in the Middle East, to have had a positive relationship with a Christian person when they're very young. Now, I mean, we don't know how the Lord's going to use that, but I mean, you think about Naaman the Syrian, right? A little girl. And this is probably even in a way more significant. This is somebody who put me to bed. This is, when I cried, I got hugged. I don't know what that's going to mean if the Lord tarries and so on. But the point here is, it is not a barrier. Saudi Arabia is not a barrier. The Filipino housemaids. Or, again, as a couple of years old, thousands of Myanmar Burmese Baptists, construction workers commissioned by their church to be missionaries in China. That's a very poor country. They'll work for a lot less than a Chinese construction worker. They don't have a problem getting a visa. They're recruited. So, what are we supposed to do? Number one, pray for them and support, encourage. We could quit on that part. That's my thing on what's the 21st century. Find you ways to join with God's people around the world to do things that some of us can do and others can't.
Mm-hmm.
And not fret that, well, I'm not like so-and-so. No, I mean, how are you wired? How can you participate? And we'll see how the Lord used some people. The Apostle Paul, I think, goes without saying, was wired in extraordinary ways in terms of his education in the Old Testament. He could say, I was a Pharisee. You think you're hot stuff? And he obviously was well educated in the Hellenistic literary tradition, right? He could quote one of their poets in Athens. I doubt that Peter the fisherman could have done that. He was wired differently. And Paul Paul never uses his Roman citizenship to assert privilege, right? I think he used it once to protect Lydia and the house church. I don't know, that's my interpretation. And he did use it probably to preserve his life in Jerusalem. But he leveraged that. It was in one of the readings, right? What's the difference, public, private, witnessing and so on? He leveraged that big time to a hearing with Caesar. That's not asserting privilege. That's being strategic. So if you see a barrier, if I see a barrier, especially a door that sure looks locked to me, don't assume that it looks or is the same to others. And today, the incredible international migration of people has to play into that in enormous ways. So what dimensions of our age constrain or facilitate the intercultural transmission of the gospel? To whom? And ask God, how has he wired you to fit in? Let's review. All right, I'm sick of saying that. And as you read about the history of missions and think about the world today, if you don't have access, you're not going to do anything. Fair enough? But anybody who has tried to be a youth minister knows that access and attention are very different concepts. How are you going to get people's attention? And in history, how have missionaries gotten people's attention? Sometimes they got the attention to the wrong thing. That's part of that human frailty and so on. And how to present the gospel in an acculturated way. There's probably a shorter word there somewhere, but it fit with the A's. Presentation of the gospel. To tell and to show, so that the offense is the offense of the gospel and not the offense of the messenger. And a final example, I wanted to pay homage to Ralph Winter here quickly. The last time we were together, Ralph had given a talk on higher education. He was arguing that higher ed functions in the world today somewhat comparably, like the trade routes and the road system did in the Roman Empire. And further, in Paul's day, Roman citizenship, in Ralph's term, was the coin of the realm. That mixes metaphors, but so what? So what functions comparably in our age? And Ralph said a PhD from a secular university, and better yet, a faculty position at one. That gives you access, but also attention. Academics pay attention to other academics and know how to get one another's attention. They may not know how to speak to the rest of us, but they tend to know how to speak with other academics and have ways of showing what it means to follow Jesus to them. And yeah, Joe mentioned I got a PhD from Michigan State. And when Norma and I get married, we just figured I would go to grad school sometime. The issue was which one and in what field or discipline and so on. And I wanted some ministry experience first. So we lived in the Philippines for close to 7 years. And not from Ralph Werner, but from one or two other people, I was encouraged not to get a seminary PhD, including by the president of Calvin Seminary, who had a degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. Because he said seminaries will tend to focus on really knowledge. Universities tend to focus on research skills. Now, he was picking up, he knew me, he'd been my advisor when I was a student there. But also, Norma and I figured that whatever the Lord had in store for us, it was probably going to involve some level of travel and crossing borders. And that was Ralph's point about the secular university. So I chose not to go to Fuller, where a good friend of mine had gone, or Princeton, which had a good missions program. I regret to say that my other option was in Ann Arbor. And it was not a choice between universities, it was a choice between fields. It would have been a PhD in Southeast Asian history. I would have been as narrow could be. And instead I studied with a guy named Ted Ward at Michigan State and others in the wonderfully sloppy field of education. So educational anthropology and curriculum research. But, you know, on visa applications, they don't give you much space to write where you went to school. Some of you have filled out a bunch, you're agreeing with me. So after I've written Michigan State University, there's no space for Calvin Theological Seminary or Trinity Christian College, for goodness sake.
U of M, sure.
Well, the University of Michigan would have been just the same. It would have filled up the line. So I'm not naive in thinking that the Chinese government didn't know that I was the director of Christian Reformed World Missions. All right? And that I had a degree from Calvin Seminary and all this other stuff. But I didn't lie to them. I filled in the blank. And I didn't put down that I was the director of Christian Reformed Missions. Because missions is a politically dirty word in China, not a religious one. It's political because it pulls up Western colonialism. Other countries, it's a religious problem. But all agency directors were officers of the Synod. It said that in the Board of Trustees handbook. So I put down that I was an officer of the Synod of the Christian Reformed Church. And I still have a number of years on the multiple entry visa that they granted. I don't know what would have happened otherwise. But I crossed some borders such as Pakistan, Myanmar, maybe Bangladesh, where Egypt, where there probably would have been greater scrutiny. But, you know, how's the Lord wired you? What have you got? And, you know, you don't have to be young to go to school. I wasn't a kid when I went to Michigan State. I'm really serious about that. You know, what might you be able to package together that would open doors, not just internationally, but here? And how can you facilitate others? Now, you talk about the academic network and highways. Ralph and I just talked about people in the US. Kenyatta University, I have a good friend in Nairobi who's a professor of civil engineering. He's a wastewater expert. He teaches at the Jomo Kenyatta University of Science and Technology. Routinely travels to a number of countries that I would guess I would have a much harder time getting in. I mean, without any problem, to conferences and to present papers and the like. That's part of that network. He's a devout Christian person, an elder in his church, and so on. So that network is not just people resident in the United States. That's very international. A whole lot of Filipinos traveling here, there, everywhere on the academic highway. Kenya, though, Nairobi has 3 world-class universities, and I think the bulk of their faculties are people who have church ties. Some probably, you know, not quite as robust as others. Anyway, that's a little homage to Ralph. Now the real stuff. All right. We went over this already, right? After Pentecost, you had these Jewish pilgrims go out and about. Stephen Neal, book I beat up on, but is a solid source, paperback, estimates that by the end of the 3rd century, at least 10% of the people in the Roman Empire had become Christian.
Wow.
Now, the Apostle Thomas and or Bartholomew may have made it to India. The gospel got there sometime, a long time ago. And there's an unsubstantiated legend that Thomas or somebody preached in China that long ago. I just don't know if that's true. It's not far-fetched. second and third centuries, you get sporadic persecution. Sometimes it was terrible. Other times, not so bad. What do Roman administrators want? Peace and quiet, right? And one of the Plinies, there's Pliny the Elder and Pliny the Younger, I'm tired, I don't remember which it was. He writes this report back to Rome. He's up in the woods in Europe. And he says, okay, I get this order to persecute the Christians. And, I really challenge them and I give them some time and whatnot. But then he points out, these people don't cause any trouble. And in another place, there's a phrase, there's no want among them. That's a powerful testimony to our brothers and sisters.
Mhm.
So, he would obey his orders, but he was not looking to persecute anybody. But there were periods when persecution was extremely intense, particularly around Rome. And somewhat in Asia Minor, where you had colony cities. That's where, Paul went lots of places. May have been picked because of geography, may have been picked for strategic reasons. But a number of them were sort of, more Roman than Rome itself. It said that in Rome, they knew that the emperor put his toga on, one, I don't know, at a time. Out in the provinces, they often had more robust Romanness, thus more persecution. And toward the end of the first century, it's clear the Romans figured it out. These people are not Jews. It's separate. And therefore, those Roman lists, they were no longer legal. But in the 4th century, you get an edict of toleration. Now, no document was ever found, but the historians talk about an edict of Milan, which is not just toleration, but full legal equality. Later in this century, you do get backsliding on the part of the Roman Empire. And I think the speaker last week talked about that. Justinian the Apostate and sort of revives pagan Romanism. Anybody Irish?
Yeah.
Well, there's
On
Patrick.
St. Patrick's Day.
I don't know if, did he get the snakes out of Ireland? I don't know, but he got the gospel in.
Yeah.
Also in the 4th century, Ulfilas, bishop to the Christians in Gothia. He translated much of the Bible from Greek into Gothic after he devised an alphabet by himself, I guess. And it's known that he was involved in the conversion of the Visigoths to a form of Arianism. You want to know what that is, and you don't know, ask a historian or a theologian, but it's a view of Christ that was not accepted by the church in the West. So you start to get separation right from the start between the church in the East and the church in the West. And in the 6th century, remember, Patrick goes to Ireland. Columba leaves Ireland for the island of Iona off the coast of Scotland. Over the next 2 centuries, this community served as a mission center for the evangelization of Scotland.
Hmm.
And Scotland, anybody Scottish? You said you're Irish.
Both.
Okay, you're both.
And Swedish.
Well, Andrew Ross, a Scottish missions historian, claims that Scotland, on a per capita Christian basis, has sent more missionaries than any other nation in the world.
Wow.
Probably right.
Hmm.
Remember Eric Little? Chariots of Fire? I forgot what year, but a British runner got a gold medal in the Olympics. And the reporter said, "Who was that for? Harold Abrams or?" And I said, "No, that was for Eric Little." Said the reporter didn't check where this guy actually was from. He was United Kingdom, but he was Scottish. An incredible missions heritage in Scotland. And Iona community, I mean, there's not historic continuity, but you can go there today. There is a Christian community that is very focused on worship, on prayer, and develops wonderful resources for that, for retreats. I've never been there. One of my students was, and said it was a very spiritually enriching experience. Their heritage goes back here, even though there's a gap of some significant time. And Nestorians, that's another variant understanding of the person of Christ. They go to China near the end of the 6th century. So they're in Western China. And their Christian communities lasted a long time. They were eventually suppressed. Well, some people think they lived underground, but there you go. So there they arrive in strength. And then here in the 9th century, the emperor ordered all monks, so not just Christians, but Taoists, Buddhists, and so on, to return to the world. In other words, to get out of the religious oysters. All right. See, and probably nobody in Europe knew about that. Different worlds. Now, in the 7th century, the rise of Islam severely constrains mission efforts and greatly reduces numbers and influence of Christian churches. And the rise of Islam also largely isolated Western Europe from Asia and Africa. As it made the Mediterranean, remember the Romans, Mare Nostrum, our lake? All right, well, it made the Mediterranean unsafe for Christian traffic, and Muslims also dominated the Indian Ocean. Now, it is remarkable how quickly Islam took over a huge area of the Christian world. And that's been a great puzzlement, in a generation. Areas that had been strongly Christian to historians. You got that? Were overrun. Before this period, Rome was a significant Christian city, and the Bishop of Rome was significant, but his counterpart in Alexandria could say, I have a much older New Testament library. Fair enough. And Constantinople and Jerusalem. Those cities were all quickly taken over by Islam. So the power differential in the Christian world really shifted. And that made the Bishop of Rome far more significant in the Christian world. And Becker's very brief version of how on earth could that have happened, discipleship probably hadn't gone very deep. And it's one thing that historians would study about, namely bishops and writers and the like, were Christian. It didn't mean that everybody in the streets was, even if they were all church members and so on. For those of us with our heritage in Europe, you remember Clovis? That's sometime in the 4th century. He's in what's today France, so he gets converted. He's king. And he wanted to have his whole army baptized. So, for the cavalry, saddle up, and for the foot soldiers, line up. We're going to walk for a river. But you hold one body part out of the water. What was that? And it wasn't their nose. Right arm. Just to figure they're all right-handed. Their sword arm. That wasn't baptized. So just as an image, you could read, well, this whole army was baptized, came to faith. Well, excuse me, if you're deliberately excluding, the arm that holds the sword, come on. That's the only explanation that doesn't get me really worried, I guess. How how could Christian faith have evaporated? It must not have been very deep. But it meant that Europe was never totally cut off. You know, Latourette would talk about the Dark Ages. When I was in college, no, we don't call it Dark Ages anymore. They weren't that dark. And today we know there was trade around the Mediterranean and so on, but not that much. But during this period, Boniface, missionary to Germany, he goes to the continent, and he's identified as having the first well-developed mission strategy that we know about, because he wrote some letters and treatises, and they have survived. Somebody else may have had a well-developed strategy before. This is the first one we know about. That's what he looked like. He's got sword through the Bible. Now, he preached to Germanic peoples in a language which they could understand. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Have missionaries ever preached to people in a language they couldn't understand?
Uh-huh.
Yes. All right. Not rocket science, but not everybody's figured out. Number two, he defied local gods, demolished shrines, cut down sacred trees, and built churches on holy sites. Now, you think power encounters are a new thing. These are power encounters. So, yeah, they would tell him that tree is sacred. Get me an axe. That takes guts.
Yeah.
That takes guts. He founded monasteries with academic schools, but they also taught agriculture, grazing, and domestic arts. That sounds like World Vision. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe not so much the school part, but literacy and agriculture, sustainable agriculture. I mean, that's a huge thing today. All right. Women, he brought nuns, and he was supported by the church back home, like you're looking for, right? And the rest of us, to which he sent reports and requests and received personnel, money, and supplies, and they undergirded the mission with prayer. So you think anything in your mission is, well thought out. It was back there too. In fact, we can take heart to that. All right, now, he was killed. Anybody a Frisian here? You're a Frisian, all right. I mistakenly said that the Frisians killed St. Boniface once, and boy, did I get blasted. He was killed in Stockholm, which I thought was in Friesland, but it is, but the Frisians don't quite. It was near Stockholm, in Friesland, in the Netherlands, on the Zuiderzee. And that's a sad thing. But that didn't end these missions. What ended them Hagar, the Vikings, right? And in your reading, it says nobody had the guts to go up to the Scandinavian countries and preach the gospel. I think that's overstated. I think it was worth being scared of them. But the Vikings were very pre-Christian, and they raided. They didn't colonize, they raided. And that ended, that made that British channel, English channel, unsafe to cross, and so on. The 9th century, it Byzantine missions to Slavic peoples. Cyril and Methodius, the Cyrillic script? Heard of that? That's what Russian, Ukrainian, and so on is written in.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's Cyril. Now, how are you wired? How are you raised? These guys had playmates who spoke Slavic. So they learned it as kids. They served as administrators in the imperial government. One was a professor, the other one was a government administrator. They retired. They were second career missionaries. That's not new. What did they stress? The use of the vernacular in Bible reading and liturgy. At this time in Western Europe, what language is being used? Latin, right? Ecclesiastical Latin. They stressed local language. Use of indigenous or local clergy. Now, as a Western person, I think they had it a little bit easier because their clergy really just had to learn how to do the liturgy. They didn't necessarily have to know much of the theology behind it. So that's compensating for my weaknesses maybe, but one thing that I look for in looking at missions history, how soon do you see local leadership in the church? And for those, even Western North Atlantic churches like mine, how soon before they ordain elders, deacons, and pastors? You can play that out in your own church polity. How soon before? Philippines took a long time to ordain the first Philippine priest. When I lived there, the University of Santo Tomas, which the provost, who was a Filipino, told me is older than Harvard, which it is. Provost was Filipino, the president was still a Spaniard. He may have been a good guy, but he was not a local person. So here is a stress on indigenous clergy and a concern for what they call the responsible selfhood of the church. So that Orthodox churches, the Eastern churches, are connected, but they're not connected in the same way that the Church of Rome was. There's no Pope. He's not in the same way that the Roman Catholic Church has. Now, their missions ended with the rise of Islam, but that doesn't mean that the churches that they started did not continue. Crusades, by and large, a disaster for Christian-Muslim relations. But on the other hand, they stimulated appetites, right? Crusaders experienced Damascus steel, and they experienced taste. Northern European food being, even to this day, rather bland. And that prompted trade. 12th century. So that's during that period, okay? Francis of Assisi, remember him?
Yeah.
All right, used to go out and preach to the birds and so on. He preached to a Muslim sultan and created a missionary force which preached in love and peace. To him is attributed that statement, preach the gospel always and if necessary use words. My tradition says, But the Franciscans have that embedded quite deeply. They really stress showing the gospel. Raymond Lull. Here's where Ruth Tucker's book is enlightening for some of us. Lull attempted to convert Muslims by reasoning, by the instrument of debate. And for decades before his martyrdom, he begged popes and kings to establish colleges for the teaching of Arabic and other languages and for the training of missionaries. I thought I was the first. I have urged many, many of my students to learn Arabic. A couple took me up, not too many. I never had the guts. He said 3 things are necessary. 1, we have to understand the language. So what's that? That's the wall to go over, right? The wall in the canyon stuff. And he suggested we have international students. You think that's new? Bring students from there, here. There you go. Now he was challenged to come up with a book, Apologetics, in which the truth of the Christian religion would be demonstrated by what the Mufti here called necessary reasons. Now, Lull also stressed a willingness to be a faithful and courageous witness, even at the cost of life itself. And he was martyred, he was killed. You won't find the next point in a lot of the standard books. Ruth Tucker asserts, and she's absolutely correct, the Franciscans sought martyrdom. They misread the Bible, I think. They thought one who loses his life for my sake. It's not, the Greek word is not bios. It's not biological life. It's suke. It means yourself, which is a lot harder. Agreed?
Yes.
I mean, if we just had to give up our physical life, I wouldn't want to do that, but that'd be easy. No. Jesus said you have to give up yourself, your desires and everything else. You have to follow me. But the Franciscans thought that Jesus wanted them to risk their lives, even to invite persecution and martyrdom. Hey, Marco Polo, there's some question whether they ever made it. Doesn't mention chopsticks and some other things. 15th century, the Pope issues a bull affirming the rights of the Portuguese to peaceful occupation of all lands of unbelievers, which they might discover on the west coast of Africa. He authorized the Portuguese to take property of unbelievers and to enslave them. Now that's important in the United States. If you know the discussions about the right of this discovery in 1823, it's Johnson versus McIntosh. Chief Justice of the Supreme Court John Marshall argued for a universal doctrine of discovery that has to do with Native Americans, their lands, and so on in the United States. And that has clear legal, this is not a theological doctrine, it's a legal one. Today, a lot of that sort of stuff is being very much studied. And I mean, it's more than just dirty linen, it's bad stuff in Western history, and it's somewhat mixed up in missions history. Because that discovery gave legal title to that government whose subjects are under whose authority the discovery was made against all other European governments. So first Portugal and then Spain. And you can follow that quite a bit today. Did that make sense there? Why that's an issue? See, that gave those two nations the right to enter huge parts of the world. They had to move the line later because of Brazil, and the Portuguese had been there first, and it looked like that was going to be Spanish, so they moved the line. Have you heard the line of demarcation? That's what this was connected with. And so this period of exploration was done under that framework. If I discover it, I can take whatever's there. And later, Alexander VI, remember him? He was Alexander Borgia. He was supposed to be celibate, had a bunch of kids. HBO, even he got a show some years ago. Yeah, he gave trading rights to Spain with lands that had been or might be discovered to the west of the Atlantic. And look, he required the King of Spain to bring the Christian faith to peoples who inhabit these islands and the like. So here, the king is in charge of evangelization, right? The Pope is broke. He was paying a high-priced ceiling painter named Mike. So Michelangelo, the Sistine Chapel, all right? And he had his own army. He couldn't afford evangelization. So you wonder too in the Philippines why some things happened the way they did. It was really not even done under the church. It was done under the authority of the king. I got what, 2 minutes? A little bit of Calvinist missions, if anybody's interested. But we're no numerical results. So good effort in Brazil. The 17th century, this is after the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the late part of the 16th. Who gets power in the high seas? The 17th century was the Dutch. How did the golden century? But the Dutch, I think, spent the money they made on conspicuous consumption, which is why it didn't get bombed in World War II in Amsterdam. It's so fancy and beautiful and whatnot. The English invested in the means of production and so on. And so England already, during this period, is a rising sea power headed toward Trafalgar and domination. Protestant mission efforts in that period are largely confined to the territory of the political nations. So you have the Dutch Reform in Java and in Nieuwe Nederland, and that's where I was born. The British called it New Jersey, New Jersey, New Amsterdam, now called New York. 18th century sees a groundswell of mission efforts. You'll read about them. The Moravians in Herrenhut said that they were willing to become slaves if they had to evangelize slaves. David Brainerd. David was a missionary to Native Americans in New York, New Jersey, and Eastern Pennsylvania. He kept a journal. There are big gaps in that journal. He just didn't write anything. I'm an anthropologist, not a psychologist. Psychologists have said he almost certainly was clinically depressed.
Mm.
Now I feel bad for him, but God uses us in our brokenness. And during those periods, who was taking care of him? In many cases, Native Americans. And the guy did get sick, probably tuberculosis. He was engaged to be married. He spent his last several months in the home of what would have been his in-laws. And I don't remember who died in the spring and who died in the fall, but he died, and the woman to whom he was engaged died in the next season. His father-in-law would have been Jonathan Edwards, who went through David's belongings after he died, and he found the journal. And I didn't have time to go looking for my copy now because my library is a bit of a mix, but it comes in and out of production all these years and was an enormous driver in motivation to mission. This is before the Perspectives in the World Christian Movement class. All right. And in the African American section, we talked about that a little bit, William Carey. I'm gonna pull it in now, because it's right at 9. But if you go to page 14, if you have that handout still handy, I'd urge you to ponder the 3 things that are on this page. The 21st century looks back at all those years and say, you know, what hath God wrought? And what has happened that maybe was not so good. There's all kinds of research and writing today that will say that missionaries participated in colonialism. We need post-colonial views and so on. Those need to be taken seriously. But the spread of the gospel happens in spite of human weakness. You can read Dana Roberts' statement at the top. The spread of the gospel happens because of intentional human relationships across cultural boundaries. Then you go down to the bottom. I'm told that David Hollinger is actually kind of critical of anything Christian. His book is not at all critical of the missionary enterprise in the United States. He says probably its biggest impact was in the United States. Because people came back critical of racism, imperialism, he's not devout, and religious orthodoxy. So one of the greatest impacts in our country of missions really was what the missionaries brought back here. Does that make sense? So think about what you bring back, whether it's a short-term trip or a long-term one, and how you know, how God has wired you to bring back and to shape. A lot of the impact of those 20th century missionaries has been through the U.S. Foreign Service, through the United Nations. Again, this may be 5 years out of date, but in the U.S. Foreign Service, way overrepresented missionary kids. I've only been in Zimbabwe once. I missed the ambassador because the U.S. congressman arrived that same day. And the meeting that I was supposed to be in, we ended up with the head of USAID. The ambassador played soccer, football, with minister level counterparts in many African countries, because he was a missionary. I don't know if he went to Rift Valley Academy or another school. So he's on a first name basis with people with whom he's representing our country. It's assemblies of God. I will assume he was quite devout also. No, but that's a mission's impact. And then finally, have any of you some of you read the article by Robert Woodbury? I'm going to end with that. Woodbury had a terrible time getting his stuff published. He got his PhD, which was mainly historical, on saying, yeah, missionaries, colonialism, bad, etc. But many of them stood over against oppression of people. They stood over against business interests that ran roughshod over local laws and peoples and so on. It was mainly historical. If you hang in there long enough, they're probably going to give you your degree, as long as your footnotes line up and so on. And his advisor in Christianity Today said, and they found out, yeah, they gave him his degree. He got a job at the University of Texas. He's tenure track. How long does he have? 6 years. So he has to publish. Writes up dissertation, comes back. This article does not meet the scholarly standards of this journal. Now, I don't know the sequence of all these pieces. There was a second submission. I don't know if that was before or after he got a multi-$100,000 grant from the Templeton Foundation. The second article came back, which was more statistically grounded. This article does not meet the scholarly standards of this journal. And, you know, the clock is ticking. At one point, he had 50 numbers crunching grad assistants gathering data and doing statistical stuff that you may, think is fun. I don't know anything about. They had enough stuff to work at the causal level. And he ran out of time. So the third submission was published in the American Political Science Review. I'm not a political scientist. It is said this is the most prestigious academic journal in political science in the United States. It wins the Article of the Year award. The journal, I think, feared people would not believe what he said. So they did. I've never seen this. I'm told it is rare, but I've never seen it. The back part of this are all the statistical charts and so on. Why wasn't this accepted? Because he argued, even if nobody got converted, the mere presence of what he calls conversionary Protestant missionaries, so not missionaries connected to a state church, so not Anglicans, doesn't mean that there weren't good things there, but conversionary Protestants, which I probably would fit almost all of us, if not all of us here. Wherever they were, he says, demonstrates historically and statistically, conversionary Protestants heavily influenced the rise and spread of stable democracy around the world. This is not rocket science. The statistics may be. What's the most powerful driver? This is Michigan State speaking, okay? Development economics. Most powerful single driver of economic betterment. If you're going to do one thing, teach girls how to read.
Amen.
You can be a pagan at Michigan State. If you're a development economist, they will tell you the number one surefire, can't miss, thing to do to improve people's lives. Teach young girls how to read. If, remember the Jews, you gotta learn how to read, for us too, right? You gotta learn how to read to know what God said. And even though in a number of churches, men, are way overrepresented in director positions and so on than women, but everybody was agreed that women were image bearers of God and had to learn how to obey all that Jesus taught. So you teach them how to read. Problem: Bibles are expensive to import. There are local printing means, but they are extraordinarily expensive, and they're only for wealthy elite folks. William Carey developed a printing operation. So you invent. If you can print Bibles cheaply, you can print newspapers cheaply. If you want to foster the bedrock of democracies, you have to have a free press. You have to have the capacity to criticize. Now, Woodbury is a devout Christian. He thinks conversion is really important, but he says it really doesn't matter if people were converted or not. What conversionary Protestants did can be shown at the causal level. In other words, you can explain that to us sometime. You're a math person. At the causal level, if they were there, the standard measures of good governance and liberal democracy show up strongly. So that's a heartening thing to end on. And to keep in mind, Woodbury does not, baptize or cover over or so on sin. But the work of the gospel happens no matter what. And so I hope that you will see that with some detail in the readings for the next 3 weeks. And I sure hope well beyond this class.